Yul Brynner moved across the dust-covered ground of the Tepoztlán, set with measured steps that raised no sound from the baked earth beneath his boots, watching Bronson clean his revolver in the shade of an adobe wall where the midday Mexican sun created harsh shadows that concealed expressions while revealing the kind of methodical precision that characterized men whose survival had depended on maintaining weapons with care that most actors never understood because their relationship with violence remained theoretical rather than practical. June 1960, 12:30 in the afternoon, when the temperature reached levels that drove normal conversation into whispered exchanges and made every movement deliberate because wasted energy could mean the difference between endurance and collapse, and two of Hollywood's most dangerous men were about to engage in the kind of wordless communication that established hierarchies through methods that transcended verbal negotiation and entered territory where authentic respect was earned rather than demanded through position or reputation that could be challenged when circumstances revealed the truth. If you're fascinated by untold stories where Hollywood's most lethal performers recognized each other through demonstrations that required no words because genuine capability spoke through actions that left no room for misinterpretation, subscribe for more hidden moments where legendary reputations were validated through encounters that industry observers preferred not to analyze too closely because they revealed truths about authentic authority versus manufactured appeal. The Tepoztlán locations stretched endlessly under merciless sun that bleached color from everything except the dark leather of gun belts and the glint of metal that caught light in ways that reminded everyone present that they were recreating an era when survival depended on capabilities that modern civilization had made unnecessary for most people but which some men had never abandoned, because their backgrounds included experiences where such skills remained relevant to circumstances that others couldn't imagine facing. Bronson occupied his corner of shade with the stillness that came from men whose early life had taught them to conserve energy for moments when explosive action might be required without warning, his weathered face revealing nothing about what he was thinking while his hands performed the ritual of weapon maintenance with automatic precision that suggested countless repetitions under conditions where mechanical failure could carry consequences extending far beyond inconvenience or professional embarrassment. At 39 years old, Bronson possessed the kind of physical density that made observers understand why casting directors had recognized his potential for roles that required projecting authentic menace rather than theatrical approximations of danger that impressed audiences, but wouldn't convince anyone whose experience included contact with genuinely dangerous men, whose presence created instinctive wariness in people whose survival instincts hadn't been dulled by excessive civilization. His background included elements that publicity departments preferred to minimize when creating marketable biographies for audiences who wanted their heroes to possess interesting histories, without being reminded that some forms of authentic toughness were developed through circumstances that most people couldn't survive and wouldn't want to attempt under any conditions that offered alternatives to hardship that shaped character through methods that civilized society had learned to avoid. But Bronson's silence wasn't merely professional reserve or calculated mystique designed to enhance his screen image. It was the natural state of someone whose communication had always been more direct than verbal, understanding that words often served to conceal truth rather than reveal it, and that men who possessed genuine capabilities rarely felt compelled to discuss them with people whose own experience couldn't provide adequate context for understanding what authentic competence actually required. The set had emptied during the midday break as cast and crew sought shelter from heat that made physical exertion dangerous for anyone not accustomed to working under conditions that tested human endurance beyond normal Hollywood standards, leaving only those whose constitutions could handle extreme environments without significant discomfort or loss of efficiency that might compromise professional obligations. Yul approached Bronson's position with the kind of deliberate movement that characterized predators evaluating potential rivals, not seeking confrontation but requiring clarification about territorial boundaries that could only be established through direct assessment of capabilities that couldn't be determined through reputation or casual observation of behavior under controlled conditions, where authentic responses were suppressed in favor of diplomatic courtesy that concealed true intentions. The dust swirled around their boots as desert wind carried particles that had been ground fine by centuries of sun and erosion, creating an atmosphere where normal social protocols seemed less relevant than primitive instincts that emerged when men faced each other under conditions where civilized pretenses offered no protection against judgment that would be based on demonstrated competence rather than manufactured appeal or carefully managed public images. Neither man spoke because both understood that words would serve no purpose when the only question that mattered was whether each possessed the kind of authentic capability that commanded respect from others, whose own qualifications extended beyond entertainment industry standards into territory where genuine authority was measured through methods that couldn't be faked or approximated by men whose training was limited to controlled instruction rather than practical application under circumstances where mistakes carried permanent consequences. Bronson's hands never stopped their methodical weapon maintenance, but his eyes tracked Yul's approach with the kind of peripheral awareness that characterized men whose survival had required constant vigilance against threats that might emerge without warning, from directions where casual observers wouldn't think to look for danger that could materialize faster than conscious thought could process and respond to challenges that demanded immediate rather than considered responses. The afternoon heat created mirages that made distant objects shimmer with uncertainty, but the space between the two men remained crystal clear as they evaluated each other through methods that owed nothing to Hollywood protocols and everything to instincts that had been developed through experiences where accurate assessment of potential opponents could mean the difference between continued survival and becoming cautionary tales about overconfidence and abilities that hadn't been properly tested against authentic opposition. 10 seconds passed in complete silence while both men processed information that could only be gathered through direct observation of posture, breathing, hand position, and eye movement that revealed more about genuine capabilities than any conversation could provide, because words could be calculated to deceive, while physical responses to stress and evaluation were considerably more difficult to control or manipulate according to desired impressions. That's when something shifted in the desert atmosphere that made both men understand simultaneously that their mutual assessment had reached the point where theoretical evaluation needed to be replaced by practical demonstration that would establish definitively whether each possessed the kind of competence that their reputation suggested, or whether carefully constructed images would crumble when tested against authentic rather than manufactured standards of capability. The movement began so quickly that observers would have been unable to determine which man initiated the sequence, both hands finding weapon grips with identical precision while their bodies shifted into positions that maximized stability and accuracy for shots that would need to be delivered under conditions where any hesitation or imprecision would result in consequences that couldn't be corrected through retakes or apologetic explanations about misunderstandings that had escalated beyond intended boundaries. 0.4 of a second later, both revolvers had cleared leather and found targets with mechanical precision that revealed training developed through circumstances where such movements had been practiced until they became automatic responses that bypassed conscious thought and operated directly through muscle memory that had been programmed through repetition under conditions where failure to achieve required speed and accuracy would carry consequences extending far beyond wounded pride or professional embarrassment. Time seemed suspended as both men stood with weapons trained on each other, their breathing controlled and steady, eyes locked in evaluation that went far beyond normal competitive assessment into territory where authentic recognition was being exchanged between individuals whose capabilities had been validated through demonstration that left no room for doubt about what each could accomplish when circumstances demanded immediate rather than gradual results. The silence stretched through moments that felt like hours while desert wind continued moving dust around their motionless figures, creating the kind of tableau that would be remembered by anyone who might have witnessed it as education about what genuine authority looked like when it was displayed by men whose qualifications extended beyond entertainment industry standards into territory where authentic competence commanded universal respect regardless of the context in which it was demonstrated. Neither weapon was fired because both men understood that the demonstration had already provided all the information that mattered. Each had proven capable of movements that exceeded normal human limitations and suggested backgrounds that included experiences where such capabilities had been essential for survival rather than merely impressive for audiences who would never face circumstances requiring similar competence under conditions that allowed no margin for error or second chances to achieve desired results. The revolvers returned to their holsters with identical precision, creating soft leather sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the desert silence that had been broken only by wind, and the distant sounds of equipment being moved by crew members who were preparing for afternoon shooting that would resume once temperatures dropped to levels that made extended physical activity feasible for performers whose conditioning wasn't adequate for extreme environmental challenges. Both men exchanged barely perceptible nods that acknowledged what had just been established through methods that transcended normal entertainment industry protocols and entered territory where genuine respect was earned through demonstrated capability rather than demanded through position or reputation that could be questioned when circumstances required practical validation of claims about authentic competence. No words were necessary because the 0.4 of a second had communicated everything that needed to be understood about mutual recognition between professionals whose qualifications extended beyond normal acting requirements into territory where genuine authority was measured through standards that most performers never encountered and couldn't meet when challenged by authentic opposition that operated according to principles developed through experiences that entertainment applications couldn't duplicate. The afternoon heat continued beating down on the Mexican location as both men resumed their previous activities without any indication that anything significant had occurred, though careful observers might have noticed subtle changes in their interaction patterns that suggested new understanding about territorial boundaries and mutual capabilities that would affect all subsequent encounters between individuals whose respect had been earned rather than assumed through conventional hierarchies. Years later, when interviewed about memorable moments during production of films that required authentic rather than theatrical portrayals of dangerous characters, both men would describe their collaboration in terms that emphasized professional respect without providing specific details about encounters that might have demonstrated capabilities extending beyond normal entertainment industry standards. The psychological impact of those 0.4 of a second would resonate through their professional relationship for the remainder of the production and beyond, creating an understanding that went beyond normal collegial respect into territory where mutual recognition had been established through methods that most actors never experienced, because their backgrounds hadn't prepared them for encounters where authentic capability was measured against equally authentic opposition. Crew members who witnessed the silent exchange from a distance would later describe feeling as though they had observed something that transcended normal on-set interactions, though none could adequately explain what had made the moment seem so significant, beyond the fact that both men had simultaneously reached for their weapons and then returned them to their holsters without any apparent communication or visible conflict resolution that might have explained the sequence of events. The desert dust continued swirling around the location as filming resumed that afternoon, but careful observers noted that Bronson and Yul interacted with a different quality of attention and respect that suggested new parameters had been established through wordless communication that had revealed information about each other's capabilities that couldn't have been obtained through normal conversation or casual observation of behavior under controlled conditions where authentic responses were suppressed. Directors who worked with both men on subsequent projects would often comment on the unusual level of professional synchronization they displayed when working together, as though each understood exactly what the other was capable of contributing to scenes that required authentic rather than manufactured tension between characters whose relationship was based on mutual wariness rather than open hostility or competitive antagonism. But those who understood the context knew that something fundamental had been established through wordless communication that revealed more about authentic authority than any conversation could provide, demonstrating why certain men commanded universal respect while others demanded recognition that they never received from anyone whose judgment was based on direct observation rather than carefully constructed public images. The Mexican desert had witnessed an exchange that would become legend among industry professionals who understood the difference between theatrical confrontation and authentic assessment of capabilities that extended beyond normal entertainment requirements into territory where genuine competence was recognized through methods that transcended verbal communication and left permanent impressions on anyone qualified to evaluate what had actually occurred during those crucial moments. Some confrontations required words to establish dominance and communicate intentions that might not be apparent through actions alone. Others achieved clarity through demonstrations that left no room for misinterpretation because genuine capability spoke through methods that transcended verbal communication and entered territory where authentic authority was recognized rather than discussed by men whose qualifications had been proven through experiences that most people couldn't survive and wouldn't want to attempt under any circumstances that offered alternatives to challenges that tested human limitations beyond normal boundaries of civilized existence.